the African feeling for many years. And I will tell you an example. For instance, I was invited in 1985 in a restaurant in Chicago, and a poet friend of mine said, it's going to have soul food. I was very happy to discover what soul food was all about. Yeah, well, soul food is even because I was involved in soul music and soul that, and I love soul. So we get to that restaurant, and we got the list. I said, what could be soul food? It's there. So, well, I mean, they were eating, for instance, the okra that we call kimbombo, an African name, the Martinican, the French until they call gombo, like the Congolese or the Haitian. Anyway, not just to that. What I was eating in that Southside Chicago restaurant was exactly what is called now health food, which is another anachronism, which I don't understand why health food had to be non-plastic food, like cheese, beans, rice, and something like that. So it was quite interesting and quite funny at the time. In this occasion, I faced that kind of relation with the people who took me all around Chicago and trying to discover about the kind of food and the kind of culture. And the way of arts and literature that we were working in many times. For instance, we have a kind of very close relationship with part of Africa that many blacks from many Cubans are descended from the West African part. And for instance, within my family, I could be able, and many of us could be able to trace that my grandmother died at the age of 96, and she won't free because my grandmother paid her freedom, what's called el vientre libre, I mean the free womb. And I heard all sorts of stories about her life, and all sorts of stories that she was receiving from her grandmother, from her mother. And among that was, and because of the influence from a part of Africa which is very close to us, which is Nigeria, and in Nigeria from a part of that country, which is Yorubaland, we still manage, in all sense of us, just to keep all the roots from that part of Africa. Not just from Yoruba, which is one of the main contributions from Africa into our culture, which you could trace a similar parallel to the one that happened in Brazil, and particularly in that part of Bahia, where we have given all along religion the same way of identification with Africa and this particular sense. But what stayed in Cuba at the time was that for the first time, coming from two different cultures, Spain and Africa, happened a kind of blend in Cuba that is very difficult in many sense to understand for outsiders. Basically, because for one time what you call in the States, because it was labeled in this country, salsa music, is basic the Cuban roots of the Cuban music, which you trace it within the African roots. For instance, we use an instrument, and perhaps this afternoon, when you have your music panel, you could talk about that, the chekere, that is full of seeds, and it's a huira, or a big calabash, and people shake it, and that makes kind of noise. Well, I mean, we thought that we discovered that because we have in Cuba the same kind of tree, the same kind of tree, but I mean, that belongs to some part of the West part of Africa. And it happened in literature, it happened in fine arts and beauty and visual art at the same time. And in literature, what happened was that all this oral transmission of the culture coming from Cuba just lied within the national context in a mixed racial country, where you could find that the whole bulk of the Cubans, I can say 100% of them, was a very large majority share all the sense of the culture and of the language. I really want to stop here in order to answer some of your questions. I think that the panel will be trying to do the same in in that particular situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to explain to our panelists first that the movement in and out of the audience has to do with classes, and it certainly is no reflection on their wonderful presentation. Yes. No, it's just the way the classes are structured. I was really taking all the three presentations and wanted to just, in order to begin this dialogue, which I hope you have between the audience and the panelists, just to suggest to you some points that, well, really the points that I was, in fact, struck with. And there was the connection, for example, on Ms. Emma Chetter's presentation and Mr. Sardui's on the question of language. Mr. Sardui suggested that, or then stated very clearly to us, the way in which English is used to dominate or to control, and so that the language we find as we go across the world is English, and the unwillingness, for example, in this United States to speak any other language but English, and so that the writer from other than this part of the world would have to learn language. But Ms. Amishate made a very interesting point, and that is that the Englishman brought English to the other part of the world, and people in the other part of the world, people in Africa, have taken that language to forge their freedom. And it struck me then, to say to both these panelists, a work by George Lamming called The Pleasures of Exile, in which in 1960, George Lamming dealt with just this topic on the use of language, starting off from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and then one would wonder how long Ms. Amishate said, did the Englishman know that we were going to use his language to forge our freedom? And I would like to suggest that he knew a long time ago, because in the Renaissance period, when he was in fact voyaging into the country, we had Shakespeare creating a character, the Caliban in The Tempest, who says, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse." You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. I will take that language and I will use it for revolution and for change. The other point that struck me is a point that Ms. Emma Checker made, which is often made, and that is, why is it one believes that one has to be in Africa to fight for Africa? Why is it one does not have this connection to Africa? Why is it, for example, right now, and I think we do, in fact, I know that when Mandela was freed from prison, I got a call at 7 in the morning from my brother in Trinidad, and he wanted me to wake up because he wanted me to know that in Trinidad everybody was looking at it, and he wanted us here in the United States to be looking at it. And then he called the relatives we had in London, so that on my side of the family, from the Caribbean, London, and the United States, we had all called, and we were all looking at TV at the same time. So there was that feeling that we had a direct connection. But the point is well taken, that the support, the financial support, or the political support, we really don't know that. And I've heard that said to me many, many times by Africans. Mr. Dean brought some interesting points, and I will say to Mr. Dean that it so happens that the topic that you introduced us today is in fact the topic of the 91 conference, which is the black writer in a pluralistic society. And you engaged us in some discussions that we will in fact discuss directly in the conference. But there were some things that I must say that bothered me just a little bit. I wondered where you said that the audience does not support, the black audience does not support the arts, and therefore that is an explanation as to why it is the arts don't flourish. That in a Broadway play, you do not have a black audience, and therefore how can you expect to have the support of the black plays? But then you said something else. You said in the movie industry, 40% of the audience is black. And then I asked you, why then aren't there black films flourishing? And I would suggest to you, because of that nice word called Alice Walker's book. But it certainly put on the floor the whole debate on the oppression of women. It certainly brought it right onto the floor, and it came right across, and it entered every single arena. And those were writers making the change. And I think that, although I agree with you very definitely on your point about over-politicizing art, I definitely think that art is a very strong weapon and has been used over and over, and that the writer has to be very conscious when he or she is writing that he or she is working with an instrument that can be extremely powerful, and in fact can reduce us if the art is bad. Can reduce us. I was also interested in Mr. Sardui's presentation about the introduction that one gets in the United States, a black Cuban worker, and I broke out laughing when he said a black African, a black Cuban writer, and I almost cracked up when he said a black African writer. And it again suggests that whole, well, it has all kinds of suggestions to me, because it immediately occurred to me that in my part of the world, in Trinidad, one would never get that introduction, although it seems to be now that that's the kind of introduction one has to have. Those were some points that struck me as our three speakers presented. I'm sure that there were many others that struck you, and perhaps you'd like to begin with some questions to our panel. Okay, let's feel them. Let's see what Mr. Jackson wants to say. Yes.
Can you hear the question?
Well, okay. Can you speak from the mic, please?
Well, we don't
Oh,
have
you
a
can
roll
hear
in
me.
mind.
You will hear me just a minute till I find the sound. My comment about Spike Lee is this only, and while I will go back and talk a bit about what Chair said, you have to be very careful, particularly with film, as to how a film ends. And do the right thing, which
Bantu and South African language. I don't know whether you saw it here in the States. And these South African children actually left school and fought their own way, wanting to say, now we've got this language. It doesn't have to, it doesn't mean we have to stop using our own mother tongue or our own emotional language. I speak 3 or 4 African languages, and I still think in my emotional language. But if the white man has been aware that with this tool he's giving you, I'll be able to communicate with you, with us, they wouldn't have given it to us. So it's really now going back to say we won't use it. I'm sorry about the Spanish situation, but at least we can be able to communicate, emphasizing what he said. So even Shakespeare wrote that 16th, 16th century, if he'd been aware, if he had known that his language would affect or have this effect today, knowing the Englishman as I know him today, they wouldn't have given it to us.
Oh no, I agree with you that the English, that the people in general didn't know it. I'm saying that the artist in Shakespeare, the artist had the vision of knowing, because certainly this was the tool that the European created, gave this creature that had this language. No, I mean, within the context.
You have to remember Shakespeare was also a hack. You have to be a genius. And he was writing those plays pretty fast. And we don't even know, really, if Shakespeare said that.
Well,
The actors, no, I think it's very important. Because in the Elizabethan period, where there was an attempt to get the Moors and the so-called Negroes, Shakespeare was right. Now later on, when those things were being printed, it was the actors getting together and remembering the lines. So we don't really know what Shakespeare said all of
the point I was making is, regardless of whether he said it or not, within the context of the play, there is that very early realization that language can in fact be used against someone. The realization that language can be revolutionary, which
Well, it may be evolutionary. As you pointed out earlier, you do not, there's never been a revolution that came from language. You have to use a gun. People do not take power with talk. You take power with action. You can sing spiritual and all of that. King did use nonviolent resistance, which is a passive thing, in a very aggressive manner. But they certainly couldn't use it in South Africa. They can sing all the songs they want to. They will not take that government unless they get a gun. Yeah.
Mr. Sartre, you had a comment?
What's another comment? Yeah. Yes, just briefly, I want to, because this subject has been on and on and on and on years, decades, many decades, and will carry on. And I remember this same conversation, this same talk about the power of the gun, of the power of the language of the world in London with Edward Brathwaite and this big brother, which is amazing. But for us, there were people, language, like your currency, is a way of domination. Absolutely. Because we are not able to communicate with the other or to defend ourselves without your language, because nobody will pay us attention. Basically, culturally, you have to go, those who are still neo-colonial dependent from the metropolis, speak English, they have to go to the metropolis in order to colonize themselves. And I remember a few months, and I think that one of the latest brothers who managed to express that was Bob Marley. It was clear, and he had to struggle in England to make his Jamaican accent English recognized as, this is my English, in London. So he had to manage to get that. So I still think that Americans, those of you born, grown, live in this country, have to think about the powerful of the language as a cultural domination. Because being here, when people say, oh, but you are black, and do you speak Spanish? I mean, why not? How many of you, do you think that just England ruled the world? happened in 1868. The slave with the machete in the hands. That was the way we managed just to recapture our language as a cultural matter. So I still think that one day when people rely, the Americans rely and say, listen, we have to share something with the other. Why McDonald's have to be the same equivalency like dollar? I mean, McDonald's is going to become your national dish. Your national dish, American dish, is not soul food. It's McDonald's. And you American, regardless of your skin color, of you come from Brooklyn, from Mississippi, or from Miami, your national dish all over the world, like your currency, is McDonald's. You all better know, Black American or no Black American, because you produce McDonald's. And that's a cultural domination way.
Oh, I would like to say in reference to that Madonna is back.
And with economic power. And I think black people, we've gotten too caught up in this for a very long time about, what people are doing to dominating us and trick us. People dominate us with power. That's what they do. They didn't go to Africa and start the slave trade with McDonald's or with language. They went there with some guns and a gun village. And if Africa today doesn't stop and start to organize itself and have an army, because Europe may very well start running out of food, they'll come right back. As a matter of fact, they haven't left. They will come right back and take it again, because the strong takes from the weak. And you can talk about culture, and you can write your books, and you can sing your songs. If you ain't got an army, and the other fellow has, he's going to take your goods. Period. And that's always been.
I think the point perhaps is that I don't think anyone is suggesting that there's either or. I think that the point is that you need all of them. You certainly need the guns, but you certainly culture also.
Culture is something you do after dinner on the porch. The Indian and England gave up India and Africa because it was bankrupt by World War II. That's what freed the colonial country, the colonies. It was the bankruptcy of the Europeans in their fight to control Africa. As World War I was fought over Germany's expansion in East Africa.
I think she was talking about the Native Americans, though.
You were talking about India.
No, you were talking about Indians from India. You were talking about American Indians, were you?
No, you said
I was talking about
India.
England.
And England got out because they couldn't afford it and because they didn't have the power to control those nations anymore.
I think also that South Africa, the Boers will ultimately lose control in South Africa, even though the blacks don't have.
Like they did in Kenya, when they still control Kenya, economically and with power. And black people have a
about how art attached type of audience and how you were talking about the politicalness in the poems. Well, I think that when blacks write poems and stuff like that, like my poems, for example, I write a lot of black poems, but there's a point where I'm like, a lot of blacks, I feel they write poems, they put politicalness in it. If you say it's not needed, they put it in there for acceptance, for identification. I mean, you can write a lot of poems without that. You can write poems like Emily Tooley Hunt wrote about beauty and the nature and everything, but no one would know if you were black or white. It would be like, well, what? Can I finish? No one would know if you're black or white. It would be an international thing. But if you write poems with a political air in it, and you put that politicalness in your black, like Langston Hughes during the Harlem Renaissance, then you're letting them know more about you. And it's like you have that vastness, like Andy Warhol and the contemporary times, the art with all the duplications of Andy Warhol's pictures of Marilyn Monroe and things like that. It's a vastness. It's contemporary because we're in a new time now. It's technology and all these things. You can do whatever you want. Like if I have a painting, I don't care what the audience says, and I can write hundreds of poems. But if I have paintings and poems, I go for one, the vastness of creativity, and I also go for the quantity of the poems. I don't look at the poems just because they're black poems or because I can write poems about flaws, about fish or anything, but it's the vastness that you have. No, the statement, the vastness, the contemporary. And I think it's accepted in thine self when you have it. And what you said, the politicalness, when these blacks put the politicalness in their poems, it's for realization and acceptance.
You're not, first of all, sir, you are misquoting and misinterpreting what I said. I said that it was over politicized. I have never said that I don't care what you write. That's not what I said. I am saying that we have to have a broader spectrum. That's all I said. That's what I was trying to get at. And that there's a tendency in the black community to try to put politics and everything on every level. That's what I was getting at. If you want to write about the walls of this building, and by the way, you're still black. I don't care what you write. You see, you can write about McDonald's and still have black writing. You see, and if you read Langston Hughes, as I'm sure you have, Langston Hughes' blackness comes out of the rhythm that he was able to catch of the community he lived in.
Okay, I want to go on to Dr. Gilliard, if I may speak, so that everyone gets an opportunity.
Yeah, let me I want to ask Mr. Hayes a question, but I'm getting confused. I'm getting confused, which ain't really all that hard for me to do, you know. But I heard him say, but I'm not sure if I heard this because we're talking about language. I think like we speak in several different languages here. But I thought I heard him say that art can in fact set a climate for social change. You said that?
Yes.
All right, so, okay, well that answers the question, but what that leads me to then is that if that is being conceded.
Wait. Are you talking, he said, what I wrote down in relation to that is it's a fantasy. It is a
No, he said it's a fantasy that it creates revolution, but I think that's why.
It's a fantasy that art can be used
Yeah, but
change.
that's why I'm trying to ask him what. That's why I'm trying to ask him what he said.
I said first that art can set a climate.
Can set a climate.
But when it comes to revolution,
You need the physical thing.
you have to have it. I think this is Mel Edwards. I quoted him. Power comes out of the muzzle of a gun. People do not give up power because they read poems, or somebody's poem, or listen to someone's music. That's all I said.
Yes.
A question from Ms. Mchana. I'd like to know what problems, if any, you encountered as an African writer in England, trying to get your work published, and what other specific problems do African women writers encounter as opposed to, say, African men writers, you know, from whom we have heard a great deal. But are there specific problems that the African woman writer encounters, above and beyond the other people?
I would like to know what problems African women writers encounter getting their work published in England as opposed to African male writers.
Like any other he started with his own Jamaican of the Caribbean English. And then for a very long time that was not recognized until he worked very hard for it. And then now we know, whenever we see his time, we know that is his time. You have to overcome that first. And then overcome the hurdle of being a woman. It's bad enough being a black person in Britain, but being a woman as well. So that's why I use in one of my titles I call double no. So your writing, I don't care what anybody says, it has to be ahead of the men's writing. Better. Before you get published. That you don't hear a lot of women's writing in Africa is because the men are writing. I'm really nice, it's not good. But if people ask you an African writer, I think the name that you speak to your man will be a Achebe or Walesheka. But I'm thinking more than these men. So you have to work harder. And in the long run, like every other woman, maybe by the time we are all dead, then we'll be recognized. But in the long run, it's going to pay us more. Because what it's doing to me is encouraging me to produce more. To break into writing in England is not easy. It is difficult. But it's a society that once you've broken into it, you stay there. When I started writing, when I first published my book in 72, we don't have these layers of black, what is press, British press now called ghetto writing. We didn't have all those people at the time. So maybe life is easier now, you break into those, gradually. But then you have to be very careful. Because sometimes when you get established on that level, your book will never be reviewed in the Times. And if you publish in England, the first thing an American publisher will ask you, what did the Times say? And if you say it's not reviewed in the Times, it doesn't have people that go in. They say, okay, we people will think about it. But if you just say, the Times said, well, it's not a good book, as long as it's mentioned there. So there is still a great difficulty. But what I tried to do a few years ago was to establish my own publishing company. And this to help women try to help them writing like myself. Again, it becomes so expensive. I had to use a house to stand as a collateral to get money from the bank. I'm still struggling with that. I'm still publishing with the mainstream. So it's not easy until we have maybe enough money or enough, maybe, muscle power like financial muscle, which you have in the States. It's still going to go on being difficult. It's not easy. But writing is one of those professions where if you don't leave it, it won't leave you. But the day you give it, it's giving you up.
We want to thank our three panelists, Senator Shezza, Mr. Sargini, for presenting us a very stimulating, interesting, provocative discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much for behalf of the life
From the Americas as well as from Africa. Today I'm going to speak about contemporary African American sculptors, 5 of them, a broad range of ages and use of media. Contemporary African American sculpture is very important as it concerns itself very directly with the transference of African artistic ideals in the New World. Contemporary African American art is very varied in its sources and its approach. It's not very easy to classify in terms of style, as it really approaches now the stylistic developments in contemporary art, in the contemporary art world as a whole. Contemporary African art, however, is dependent on the wide range of work being done today, and it speaks very directly to the concept of modernism, which is the defining principle of 20th century art. Though Eurocentric in its inception, the architects of modernism, mainly European artists in the turn of the century, mostly Paris, heavily created their definition of modernism while looking and appropriating African art. African American artists specifically, the ones I speak of today, are heir to both the definition of self-determination that happened artistically in the 60s, as well as the wholesale boom in the art market that existed in the late 80s. The first artist I'm going to speak about is Martin Puryear, whose work is on the screen. Martin Puryear is about 48 years old. He was born in Washington, D.C., now lives in Chicago. He is the first African-American artist to represent the United States at what is one of the 2 international exhibitions referred to as the Biennale. Martin represented the United States at the Sao Paulo Biennale, which was in October. Puryear's work is very important to this idea of the transference of African ideals, in that his use of materials is very traditional. He's very dependent on the use of wood, wire, mesh, all sorts of natural materials, and his craftsmanship is also very traditional in that he works all of the objects themselves. His vocabulary, artistically though, is wedded to the ideas of minimalism, which were the artistic form that many artists in the 60s adopted in reaction to realism in art. This work is called Untitled, and it's made of ponderosa pine. Next slide, please. This work is called Maroon, and it's steel, wire, tar, mesh, and wood. This work was created for Puryear's exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum last spring, and it was installed in the grand lobby there, and also was in the Sao Paulo Biennale. This is one of his works where he uses tar and mesh in building-like principles and meshing the tar onto the wire to create the sculptural form. Martin is also very indebted to the idea of biomorphism in that he is very interested in natural forms and how forms exist in nature and how they can be transferred into sculptural pieces. This work, which is sideways, but is Untitled. It's also another steel, wire, tar, mesh, and wood piece. Most of Martin's sculpture, as I said, is very wedded to the idea of natural materials and natural processes to make them. I mean, it's very common in the world of sculpture today, especially since most sculpture is very large and of non-human size. All of these works are over 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide. They're very big. Martin is one of the very few artists that creates his works himself from start to finish. This is a woodwork where Martin on the sides, as you can see, has worked the wood down to a sanded side, but the bark remains on the top of the piece. It's called for Beckworth, which is a reference to Jim Beckworth, the late 19th century black explorer, who Martin feels a certain allegiance to, as he is probably the best known African American artist today, and worked for a long time without people really, accepting his blackness as part of his work. Martin has really straddled the line in the contemporary art world because he's gotten very mainstream fame while working in a medium that really links him to his roots in Africa. Martin spent 2 years in Sierra Leone as a Peace Corps volunteer and studied boat making in Sweden, which is where he learned his woodworking techniques. Next slide. This week's work is called Charm of Subsistence. It's made out of rattan and gumwood. Again, another work made with traditional basketry techniques. Most of Martin's work also is pretty much wedded to the idea of abstraction, which is one that is really developed in African American art since the 60s. A lot of people associate African American art with its most realist manifestations, that is, very figural works that depict black people, and there is a whole school of artists that have moved away from that, who have found the language of abstraction to be equally as compelling as an artistic source. This is another untitled work. It's painted red cedar. Again, Martin uses the whole vocabulary of woods and natural material types in creating his work. Next slide. This is the last work by Puryear. It's called Lever, and it's red cedar, unpainted. Again, it's another huge monumental work, as all of his works are. The next artist I'm going to speak about is Marion Hassinger. She's a woman from California who now lives in Long Island City. She's about 45 years old. Marion's work is what we refer to as site-specific, in that she creates works for the site that they're going to be in. Her work is mostly about the absence of about the materials she creates it out of. In African art, the materials that the work was created out of were equally as important as the work that was created, so that materials weren't just the means to the end in the artistic process as they are in contemporary and traditional European art. Marin uses materials in a way that her materials speak directly to what it is she's trying to say. This work is called Veil, and it's installed at a gallery in Santa Monica, California, but basically it's a wall of branches, wire, and fabric. As I said, Marin's work speaks directly to the absence of nature in contemporary life and what she sees as our lack of dependence on nature again. And by using wire to replicate natural forms, she brings outside, inside in her installation type works. Next slide. This slide, it's somewhat hard to see because of the actual shadows. This is Veil again, but when you're standing looking at it, you literally are somewhat encompassed in the work itself because it's floor to ceiling and it's just wire pieces that connect into a very, what would be like a very primordial forest looking sort of space. This is another work similar to Veil from 1986 called Blanket of Branches, which was installed at PS1, which is a gallery in Long Island City where Marin lives. Blanket of Branches is made of branches, tree branches that Marin weaves together in a sort of formation that mimics the idea of trees and the forest and the way branches interlock with each other. Again, this work covers the ceiling so that when you're in the gallery, you're standing under it. As I said, all of her works are site-specific, so unless she has the opportunity to do them again, they're usually installed once, and that's the end of that particular work, even though she uses the same ideas over and over again because she is very interested in her uses of nature in that way. This is also Blanket of Branches. This work is called On Dangerous Ground. It's in wire. This is a detail of it. It covered a room about 5,000 square feet. She did it in 1981 at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Marin is most known for her works in wire, such as these, where she bundles together long industrial wire lengths in a way that mimics bushes, trees, shrubbery, and places them within an interior landscape to create what becomes a very natural-like setting, though you're very conscious of the fact that it is wire and not actually metal. Marin also uses wire to comment on its durability and the actual fragility of nature. Marin's been working this way for a long time, and that idea is becoming very popular in art as people are much more environmentally conscious. This work is called In a Quiet Place. It's one that she does often at different museums and galleries. This particular slide is from when it was installed at the Studio Museum in Harlem last winter. It is, again, the wire pieces that are embedded in cement blocks covered in earth to mimic the idea of, seedling shrubbery growing. Marin Hassinger is also very indebted to the ideas of minimalism in that her sculpture is very spare and its parts are very essential. And her work also, though, takes on a secondary aspect that is not essentially sculptural, because when she creates the environments, they exist as an environment and not so much a single piece of work as we are used to viewing sculpture, which is also a very Eurocentric idea of viewing art, that being it by itself, on a pedestal in a somewhat sanitary environment. Marin's work is about the idea of interaction, and when you view her pieces or in the room with them, they take on a life of their own. Next slide. The next artist I'm going to speak about is Mel Edwards, who is a contemporary of Martin Puryear's. He's also in his 50s. From New York City, teaches in New Jersey now, and maintains a studio in the Village. For the last almost 20 years, Mel Edwards has worked on a series called Lynch Fragments. I have 3 or 4, I'm not sure how many slides, of this continuing series. The idea behind the Lynch Fragments series was the use of found objects in a sculptural form, but also a reference to the actuality of lynching in African American history. The Lynch Fragments series are made out of used horseshoes, car parts, any sort of metal pieces. They also speak directly to the idea of using found objects in sculpture, which is the idea that anything essentially can become art. As a sculptor, Mel Edwards welds, so these pieces are all welded together to create these fragments. They're about a foot by a foot. They're not very big. Together, I think there are maybe 20 of them, and he installs them as he keeps creating them together. And they're a very powerful statement about sculpture as well as about African American history. This is another one. Some of them contain, links of chains, shackles, sharp objects that mimic knives. Some are very foreboding. Others, the surface is much more smoother and it looks much more like a precious object. Another. Next slide. And another. Allison Sarr is a young sculptor who is from Los Angeles, now lives in New York. Her mother is the very famous African American woman artist Betty Sarr, who is known for her work using fragments of photographs and pieces of historic items and making assemblages that speak directly to the history of African Americans. Allison, like her mother, is an artist, creates sculptures that have a lot in common with the idea in African sculpture that many of the sculptures we see now, even though they exist in a state of anonymity, were created for someone. They were either not necessarily created as a likeness, but created for a person and were created with the embodiment of that person's personality and their personal characteristics. Marin creates character-type sculptures like this one, which is called Diva, which is from 1986, where the little, and I'm sorry you can't see it in this slide, but the little transparent hole, she has a broken heart embedded in there. And in these sculptures, her idea is that the surface of someone and their insides are completely different things, and she gives you that little hole to see what's actually inside. Also, in the use of materials, this work is painted wood and metal. Allison is very versatile in her use of materials in that she paints metal, she paints wood, she uses materials that don't necessarily go together and creates a whole out of them. This work, as I said, is painted wood and metal. Also her work is very dependent on the contemporary urban idiom. Most of her works refer directly to characters that exist in the urban milieu. Next slide, please. This work is called Medicine Man, and again, it's an African reference as well as a contemporary urban reference. For Allison, the idea was that in African culture, the medicine man was the person revered and respected because he held the key to cure for whatever it was that you needed. For her, the idea in the urban environment is that the medicine man is somewhat become akin to the drug pusher, but in a very negative sort of transference of that ideal, so that this character in the medicine man is made to mimic the sort of urban day slickster character. The inside, which opens and closes, open in this slide, shows his wares and what he's about, which is what the openings are about in the work. This is a work called Against the Door, which is metal painted on a wood door. Again, as I said, Marin uses found objects, and the pants of this man, if you look them closely, are the corrugated tin ceiling that people are stripping down by the minute in lofts and industrial spaces. And Allison uses these kinds of found metal parts to create her sort of relief-like sculptures. This work is about 6 feet tall. It's the size of an actual door. It's pinned on to an actual door. Next slide, please. the work of Willie Cole, who's about 27 years old, from Trenton, New Jersey, lives in Jersey City now. Willie, again, is very indebted to the idea of found objects. About a year and a half ago, he, in the industrial area of New Jersey, found an iron factory that was closing and came across about 150 broken or unrepairable irons that he took back to his studio and tried somehow, was thinking how to incorporate them into his work. He began on this series of sculptures that used the irons. This one is called Neo-Sanufa, which refers directly to African Sanufu sculpture. And in his use of the actual iron part, which is the middle with wire and wood, he's tried to create sculptural forms that are very much like African art, but are obviously industrial parts, so it's sort of an old world, new world mix in terms of material. This work is called Sunbeam. Again, it's that same idea. This work is called Royal Rochester. This is a detail. It's part of a larger work where several of the irons, he took the facing part that you actually iron with off and affixed them to the burlap to create a larger installation. Again, referring to his use of the actual iron part. What's interesting about these sculptures is that Willie, though he makes it clear that he is using a non-artistic entity, he has created a sculptural form or a vocabulary that is almost, it becomes dependent on his use of the irons himself. This one is called Proctor, in reference to Proctor Silex, which is the brand of iron. This one is made out of, again, this is a direct mimic of African sculptural forms in, with the core of it being the iron part. This is a very young artist, Greg Henry, who was born in Guyana and now lives in Virginia and teaches at Hampton University. He's about 26 years old. All of Greg's work struggles in some ways with his very American upbringing and his more intuitive Caribbean descent as it manifests itself in his work. Again, Greg is a sculptor and a painter. I'm really only showing you his sculpture, but his painting is much more traditional in its use of abstraction. It's just very, typical kind of painting work. His sculpture, however, takes on a very different character because he uses materials in a way that he creates them to look like found objects, so that his ideal is to make art that really does not look so much like art, that is more a part of where it actually comes from, and be that garbage or nature or whatever, that's what he's doing. This work, as all of his work, is untitled, but it's wood and steel, and out of the little steel part he's made a bird, and he's tried to appropriate what would be like a boardwalk type structure with this steel bird climbing on it. This work again is untitled, and it's steel and coconut. Greg is very interested in the whole idea of how the Caribbean identity was formed within the context of the imperialist state. And in growing up in Guyana, that was very much a part of what it was he was learning, and then coming here to the United States, it became very much a part of how he formed his art. Many of his works, and most of the earlier works he showed, his metaphor for that was the use of coconuts, which was to refer directly to the Caribbean aspect of his identity in the work itself. This work is like a steel wheelbarrow part with the coconuts on it that is sometimes used in part of a larger installation. Greg Henry's work is also very interesting because he uses non-artistic technique, and that is just the idea of gathering of objects along with traditional welding as a sculptor. This is, again, untitled, and it's wood and steel. And it's a cage-like structure that is really about the idea of shelter and residence and the idea of of just structure as an ideal, using that as an artistic form. This is another work that is steel caging with coconuts, and this work refers directly to what Greg feels is the capture or the containment of the Caribbean identity in imperialized or formerly imperialized countries, such as his. This, again, an untitled work, which is wood and fiber. Again, his use of non-artistic objects with wood and sculpture. The reason I showed all these slides is, as I said, it's very interesting to see the transference of African artistic ideals in the work of contemporary African American sculptors. They almost skip over the period of European modernism in some ways and relate directly to what we know as the African, as African art history. I'd like to answer any questions, as I realize some of the artists I've shown, like Martin Puryear and Mel Edwards, are very famous, but others are unknown. And I would like, if anyone has any questions,